Hi everybody, it's Lisa here from Holistic Health by Lisa Moan, and tonight we're going to be talking about ADHD and the impact that diet can have on ADHD. So we'll follow that up next week by talking about what tests you need to run if your child has ADHD and maybe put on medication. So that will be next week, and today we'll just focus on what you can do from a dietary point of view to help your child. So we'll run through several different topics tonight. So we'll talk about food additives, we'll talk about food chemicals which are naturally occurring. We'll talk about low allergy diets, the Mediterranean diet, and we'll talk about gluten and casein as well and why they're implicated with ADHD. So the first thing we'll talk about is food additives. So those are the colours, the flavourings, the preservatives that are in most processed foods. And there was a study that took part in England quite a few years ago. Now it's probably 10 years ago. It was called the Southampton study, and it looked at the effect of food colours and preservatives on children's behaviour. And surprise, surprise, they found a connection between certain food colours and children's behaviour. So as a result of that, the EU really clamped down on the colours that they allowed in their foods. And if you wanted to continue to put some of those food colourings into your foods, there had to be a warning on the front of packet to say eating this food could affect your child's behaviour. Unfortunately, we didn't really follow suit in Australia. I would say I think Aldi at that time did take most food colourings out, if not all the food colourings, because they're a German company, so they rolled with the punches with the EU, but not many other foods did. So if your child has hyperactivity and you're worried about it and you think they might get diagnosed with ADHD, before you even go to see a paediatrician, you can quite easily just review the foods that you have in your pantry and make sure that none of these Southampton 6 food colourings are in your foods. So those colours are tartrazine, which is in things like cakes, biscuits, jelly beans, butterscotch, and it's called 102, so the additive number is 102. There's quinoline yellow, which is naturally yellow, and it's in, again, lollies, like flavoured fizzy drinks, even in some mouthwash. Not that you shouldn't be using mouthwash, and you certainly shouldn't be swallowing mouthwash. And some medications, like unbelievably, some medications actually put these artificial colours into them to make the medication look better. There's another yellow called sunset yellow, and again, it's in cakes, biscuits, custard, ice cream. So if you get that nice yellow vanilla, looks like a really natural vanilla, that could be the sunset yellow. There's carmoisin, which is in prawn crackers, flavoured milks, ice cream again. Ponzu 4R, which is in jam, Turkish delights, instant puddings, and then Allura Red, which is also in lollies and gum and things like that. So look in your pantry and see if you've got any of those in any of your foods or in any of your medications, and very easy just to chuck them out and don't buy those foods again. So that's food additives, which are artificial, but foods naturally contain chemicals. That's just, chemicals are what makes the world. So there's certain food chemicals that you really want to watch out for, and they are salicylates, amines, glutamates and oxalate. So we'll talk about these in a bit more detail as well. And to go on a low food chemical diet is really hard and really quite boring, because these food chemicals are in all normal healthy foods. So when you do want to restrict these food chemicals, you really want to do it for a very short strategic length of time, and at the same time you need to increase your child's detoxification. You need to improve their gut health and everything so that these food chemicals don't continue to be an issue for them. You certainly don't want to live on a food chemical diet. That's the number one thing to take away from this, is you don't want to restrict these food chemicals forever, or you will end up having 5 safe foods that you can eat. So with salicylates, some of the symptoms that they can lead to are hyperactivity, irritability, aggression, inappropriate laughter, and head banging. So that's a really telltale sign. If your child is head banging, like banging their head against the floor or the wall, it could be a salicylate intolerance. So you can trial it and cut out salicylates for a few days, but don't cut them out forever. Then there's amines, which again cause hyperactivity, and they cause defiant behaviour, depression, foggy thinking. I know quite a few children that might be amine intolerant. And then there's glutamates, which again cause hyperactivity, anxiety, issues with addiction, so maybe food addiction, video game addiction, those sorts of things. And oxalates. So oxalates are found in foods like spinach and rhubarb, and it can form crystals in your body if you're not digesting it properly, and that can cause pain. So it can cause stomach pain, but it can also cause irritability and foggy thinking and problems with language. And if you see a child sort of doubled over a chair trying to sort of push their tummy in, it's because they're in pain, and the pain could be because of oxalates. It could be lots of other reasons too. So that's one thing I go through with families, is go through a really detailed sort of physical assessment of their child and try and identify which food chemical that they might have an issue with, because there's other telltale signs that kind of give the game away. And so the next thing we'll talk about is gluten and casein. So that's the proteins that are in wheat and dairy. And some children can't digest the gluten and the casein properly. And when that happens, these foods actually form opiate-like compounds in the child's brain. And opiates are things like morphine, like drugs like that. So that's sort of the effect that the gluten and casein can be having on your child's brain if they can't digest them properly. And think of somebody on a morphine drug. They've got foggy thinking, they're inattentive, and they get really, really constipated. So if your child has like foggy thinking issues and they're a bit spaced out and inattentive, plus they've got really bad constipation, then it could be a gluten or a casein issue. And that will also cause them digestive disturbances and issues. So we'll move on to just talk about the Mediterranean diet. So the Mediterranean diet is the most well-studied dietary approach in the world, and it's got great evidence to support its use for like a million different things. And the Mediterranean diet is not wine and pizza and pasta. The Mediterranean diet is based on real foods, whole foods, nuts and seeds and fish and lots of fruits and vegetables. And the Mediterranean diet is more than that as well, because the Mediterranean style of eating is very relaxed. The family sits around the table, they talk about their day, they take a long time to eat. It's a very social thing. So that is an aspect of the Mediterranean diet that you can't ignore. So there was a study where they tested, it's quite funny because they did a Western diet versus a healthy diet, and the healthy diet was the Mediterranean diet and the Western diet was the unhealthy diet. And the Western style diet was associated with ADHD a lot more than the Mediterranean diet. So just switching from the standard Australian diet with lots of processed packaged foods, lots of quick eating, eating in front of devices, eating on the run, switch from that to eating real foods with lots of fruits and vegetables and lean meats and fish. And that in itself is enough to reduce the symptoms of ADHD. So that's great. You don't need expensive treatments or medication. You can just switch to the Mediterranean diet and see a benefit. And now we'll talk about doing an elimination diet, because that also has really good research for it. So in an elimination diet, it's a diet that you do for a set length of time, and you cut out all the foods that your child is likely to be allergic to. So it's the gluten, it's the casein, it's the eggs, it's the soy and foods like that. So they did a study with 40 children who were mostly boys, and they all were diagnosed with ADHD. And they did the elimination diet for 2 weeks, and 62% of the children showed an improvement of behaviour of at least 50%. So most of the children were at least like halfway along to being better after 2 weeks on the elimination diet. So imagine if your child's behaviour right now is a 10 out of 10 for being inattentive and hyperactive, you could get that down to a 5 out of 10 in 2 weeks by following an elimination diet. Like, how amazing is that? And when you take your child to see a paediatrician about ADHD, and a lot of the times they'll say, oh, there's no connection between diet and ADHD. If they look into the research, that's 2 studies that I've just mentioned that draw a very clear relationship between food and ADHD. So just touch briefly on nutrient deficiencies, because we're going to go into that a lot more next week. But the strongest evidence for nutrient deficiencies is with essential fatty acids. So we eat way too much omega-6 and not enough omega-3. So omega-3 is in fish and things like that. And omega-6 is in lots of processed foods. So we've all got not enough omega-3 and too much omega-6. And that in itself can lead to ADHD symptoms. So supplementing with fish oil, that's the most researched supplement for ADHD, and it works really well. And it calms down the inflammation in the brain, which is causing some of the negative behaviours. And the last thing we'll talk about is sugar. So if you do have any questions on anything I've talked about so far, just type them in now. But we'll talk about sugar. So people kind of know that sugar is not great for their kids' behaviour, but it's probably worse than you expect. So it's not just that short-term sugar rush that your child gets that you notice after they've been to a birthday party or whatever. It actually has a much more long-term effect than that. So sugar can actually increase dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter in your brain. And because that's getting increased, that means the receptors for dopamine in the brain reduce. So over time, if your child's eating sugar, they need more of that sugar to make the dopamine. It sort of acts like a drug. So not only is the sugar having a negative effect on them, but actually they're being driven to crave more sugar to get the same sort of dopamine effect. So cutting out sugar, again, is a no-brainer if your child has ADHD and you want to avoid medication. It will smooth their moods and balance their neurotransmitters, which is really important. So I hope you found all that interesting. Again, just type in any questions if you have them. And next week we'll talk more about what tests you should really run for your child before you think about medicating them for ADHD, or even if you have medicated and you want to wean them off it. So we're talking about nutrient deficiencies plus some other handy tests that can be really useful. So thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week.